How many of you have ever been shown grace before? Like someone showed you grace? All right, a couple of you. All right, I think to some degree all of us have had those times when we should have received perhaps punishment, or we should have received consequences that we didn't receive. And so at some point in life, all of us are familiar with the fact that we've been given grace. How many of you, let me ask you this, okay, and you can feel free just to be honest, okay? It's a safe place to be honest. How many of you have ever been pulled over for speeding before? You were speeding, you got pulled over. All right. Even Lisa Henning, so, you know. Just saying. It's a safe place. A safe place, to be honest. How many of you have been pulled over, but the officer let you off with a warning? The wonderful warning, right? So Lisa got off with a warning. You start crying, "I'm sorry, officer." I was riding in a car with my brother-in-law, who's younger than me. He had just gotten his learner's permit. And he was in my father-in-law's, one of his piece of junk vehicles he's had, you know. I mean, my father-in-law's infamous for his amazing vehicles. But it was an old minivan, I think. And he had, 5 kids who needed to drive, so he supplied them with amazing vehicles. And so we're in one of these minivans he has, and it's just me and my brother-in-law, Andrew, and he's like, "Can I drive, Doug? I just got my permit." I'm like, "Yeah, go for it." And so we're heading down 309, all right? We're going down 309 south. And he's pushing the speed limit a little bit, and I'm like, I'm the cool older brother-in-law. And I'm like, "It's good," I'm like, he's like, "Yeah, you think I should slow down?" I'm like, "No, you can go fine. People breeze through here all the time. There's never any cops, here." And right as the bypass kind of ends, at Montgomeryville Cycle Center there, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. I learned that actually there are a lot of cops there. Like they like to camp out there because the speed limit changes. And we found that out that day. So I no sooner said, "There's no cops around." Woo, the lights go on, and he started freaking out because he's been driving for like a day. He just got his learner's permit, and he's getting pulled over, and it's kind of my fault. And so I'm like, "Just play it cool. I've gone through this before." And he's like, "What do I do? What do I show him?" I'm like, "He's going to ask for your license, your registration. You better make sure where that is. Believe me, I've gone through this a couple times, and just, be very kind to him. 'Hello, officer.'" So he rolls down the window, and he comes to the window, and he says, "License, registration, please." "I told you." So he gives him license, registration. He goes back to his cop car and does what he does, gets on his computer there and looks us up. And my brother-in-law, Andrew, he's sweating it. He's like, "My dad's going to kill me. I'm never going to get to drive again. I'm going to, he's just like sweating bullets, because he was speeding. And the officer comes back. The weirdest, I've never had this happen to me before. But he hands my brother-in-law his permit and the registration and insurance cards and says, "Here, take these. I'm going to go get somebody else." And he just left. Like not even a warning. Just like, "Thanks, guys. I'm going to go get somebody else." And I looked at him. I'm like, "See, I told you. Just play it cool. Play it cool." Now, I'm guessing he saw that this kid had his learner's permit for like a day, and he was going like 10 over, and he showed him some grace. All right? And so the concept of grace is an extraordinary concept. When you think about what grace is an extraordinary concept. In fact, I will go on to say that grace is the theme of the Bible. Grace is the passion of the heart of God. If you could just read through the pages of Scripture, what you'll see rise to the surface is this thing we call grace. This thing that God Himself is really passionate about. The concept of grace is also at the very center of the gospel. See, the very nature of grace. Okay, so when you look at grace and what it is, grace mandates that it is not something that can be earned. Right? So if it is something that can be earned, it's not grace. So grace is unearned favor, unearned kindness. It is given, and thus grace is something that is in turn received. Therefore, grace is not based on merit or worth. Okay, let me say that again. Grace is not based on merit or worth, but I believe that the basis of grace is love. What we find in 2 Samuel 9 is that God takes King David on his own journey of grace. And as we've been examining David and the journey he's been on, he went from anointing to appointing. He went through God giving him this journey to receive this promised seed in a king that would rule forever, on a kingdom that would rule forever. Today, David's going to take a journey of grace. And I believe that God will take us all down our own journeys of grace, understanding what it is, receiving it, and then, particularly our focus today, being men and women who are able to extend grace. Before we hit 2 Samuel 9, I want to read to you 1 Samuel 18. It says this in verse 1, "As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David." Now we remember that Jonathan was the son of Saul, the first king of Israel. Notice what happens. "And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house," speaking of David. Now notice verse 3, "Then Jonathan, the son of Saul, made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt." Who was the king at this time? Saul. Saul's son Jonathan develops an incredibly close relationship with David, who was what? The anointed king. So here we have a covenant that God makes, or that Jonathan makes with David, where Jonathan, understanding that David is God's chosen king, recognizing that he is not chosen of God to take the throne after his father dies, Jonathan shows love, kindness, and grace to David and defers to David, understanding that, David, you will be the next king. You are God's chosen anointed king. I'm not. The amount of grace and character it took for Jonathan to extend that to David, to me, is staggering. It tells you something of the man that Jonathan was. Verse 5, "And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war, and this was good in the sight of all people, also in the sight of Saul's servants. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistines, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, with musical instruments." Okay, so the nation was advancing with their military. David, leading the military, was incredibly successful. God had blessed him. God had given him power. God had given him victory. And so as they were coming in from striking down their enemies, as was a part of the covenantal blessings of God, as Israel was being faithful to God, what was happening is the city would come out, they would sing, they would welcome the soldiers back. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, "Saul has struck down his thousands." It's pretty good. "And David his 10,000s. Uh-oh. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom?" And Saul eyed David from that day on. And so what begins in 1 Samuel 18 is the aggression of King Saul toward the anointed King David. He tries to kill him. He chases David away so that David is on the run. David has to hide in caves. David eventually finds refuge with the enemy of Israel. And this is where David found himself, the enemy of King Saul, yet the friend of his son Jonathan. And so if you were here the past 2 weeks, particularly week 1 of our series, we saw the journey David took from anointing to appointing, to where God eventually, through his sovereign plan, dealt with Saul, established David as the king of the nation of Israel. David is now reigning and ruling in Jerusalem as king over the entire nation of Israel. Generally, what would happen when a new king assumed the throne, if that king was not a part of the previous king's family, generally what would happen in this culture is to prevent any type of military coup or uprising, the family of the previous king would be executed, particularly their sons and grandsons, so that they would not try to assume the throne again. So this was common in the culture, particularly knowing the relationship that Saul had toward David and the aggression that Saul had toward David and the fact that Saul wanted to kill David. Everyone would have been perfectly understandable if David would have done away with all of Saul's family. Saul had gone after David. Saul had wronged David. And Saul in his anger tried to kill David. And yet David finds himself king of Israel. And in the middle of 2 Samuel, there's almost a parenthesis in the narrative. Because chapter 8 chronicles David's victories, God's blessing David. David's covenant faithfulness to Yahweh is being blessed as the nation of Israel at this time is living within covenant faithfulness to God. David is being blessed. He's having victory over his enemies. The kingdom is growing. Their wealth is growing. Their power is growing. God is blessing. And then chapter 9 hits. So follow with me. Verse 1 says this. And David said, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness?" So David's, after his military victories, saying, I want to show grace. I want to show kindness to someone from Saul's house for Jonathan's sake. Now there was a servant of the house of Saul, his name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." Yeah, he was Saul's servant. Now I'm your servant, all right? Just in case there's any confusion, I'm your servant now, David. And the king said, verse 3, "Is there not still someone of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness to the kindness of God to him?" And Ziba said to the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet." The king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "He is in the house of Machir, son of Amiel." Sometimes these Old Testament Hebrews names are hard to pronounce, so just say it with confidence and say it fast, no one will know. And Lodabar. So, Amiel and Lodabar, all right, we're good. Verse 5, "Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, Lodabar, and Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage." I'll bet he did. So this was the grandson of Saul. So if you put yourself in Mephibosheth's shoes, the king is called for you. Your grandfather had spent years trying to kill this king that is now your king. So initially you're going to assume what? It's going to start. Saul's family is going to be executed one by one. there's a new king on the throne. And so Mephibosheth comes with fear, afraid of what David will do, afraid of the consequences, and David, knowing this, said, Mephibosheth, and he answered, Behold, I am your servant. Everybody's David's servant now, right? I'm your servant. Notice what David says. I love verse 7. David looks at him and says, Do not fear. I will show you kindness for the sake of Jonathan, your father. And I will restore to you all the land of Saul, your father, and you shall eat at my table always. And he paid homage and said, This is Mephibosheth speaking, What is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I? So what we have in this narrative is we have David taking a journey of grace. And there's some things about grace that we're going to find out from this narrative today that are crucial for us to understand as a church. First of all, grace is given to those who least deserve it. That's the nature of grace, isn't it? So take the Mephibosheth narrative. What had Mephibosheth done to deserve the kindness that David was showing to him? Not only did David not kill him or execute him, which he could have done for the crimes of his grandfather, but because of something Jonathan had done, because of Jonathan's faithfulness, the text says, David showing kindness to who? To Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan. And so what he does is he takes all the land that Saul had owned and he restores it to Mephibosheth. Now here's the question. What had Mephibosheth done to earn this or deserve this? What had he done? He had done nothing. Mephibosheth did nothing. He was simply the son of Jonathan. At that, we're going to talk about this later, he was crippled. I mean, a crippled man in this culture was generally a beggar because he could not work, so therefore he lived in poverty. On top of that, he was the grandson of Saul, who had sinned against David. And so what we find, particularly in this text, is that Mephibosheth is finding himself before the king, receiving grace that he didn't earn. Receiving all the riches and all the wealth that he did not earn. And the primary aspect of grace is this. Grace is given to those who least deserve it. That's really grace. I mean, we could define grace very simply as undeserved kindness or favor. So when someone looks upon another with favor, but you didn't earn that favor. Let me illustrate it this way. It is one thing to reward my children when they are doing right. And that's easy, isn't it? It's one thing to give good things to my children when they behave. When they are misbehaving, when they're being disrespectful, when they're being disobedient. It's very difficult, isn't it? And even in my own parenting, there have been times when I've definitely not shown grace. But I find it important that even as a father, I model grace for them. So there are times when I will sit down with my son, particularly my oldest, because he's got a similar personality than me, and he likes to come at me. And his mom. And there are times when I've sat with him and I've said, you deserve this punishment. But rather, I'm going to show you kindness. And it tends to cripple him a little bit because he knows what he deserves. And so the conversation I have with them is, Titus, I've received a lot of grace in my life. There have been things I've done that I deserved punishment for, but I did not receive that punishment because someone showed me grace. God shows us grace. I'm showing you grace. And so grace is something that we don't deserve. But think about this, because in this room, there is a lot of pain. I know this because I've spoken with many of you. Think of David's life. Think how Saul abused him. Think of how Saul used him. Think of all of the things that Saul did to David. That if anyone would have done those things to us, we would have been filled with anger, we would have been filled with rage, we would have been filled with the desire for revenge. Why? Because when we are hurt, when someone hurts us, the natural response to us being hurt is what? Get them back. And again, I see this with my kids all the time. He hurt me, I'm going to hurt him back. A lot of hitting, right? You can see it early on in children. You get hurt, boom, the immediate response is, I want to hurt them back. They hurt me, I want to hurt them back. And I believe sitting in this room today, there's a lot of people sitting here that have a lot of hurt from the past. Many of you have someone in your past that hurt you. Someone in your past that perhaps has abused you. Someone in your past that did you wrong. They lied to you. And you can remember it. You can feel those same feelings that rise up when you think about it. That person did this to me. And what happens in the course of life is these people in our past that hurt us, they don't deserve for our forgiveness. They don't deserve for us to forgive them. They don't deserve a relationship with us. Rather, what we want is we want to hold on to our anger, don't we? We want to hold on to the hurt. We want to hold on to the pain because after all, look at what they did to me. Yet what we find, particularly from this narrative, is that you must be willing to forgive the ones who hurt you in the past. David's attitude towards Saul to me is remarkable. And we understand from the text that his motive is the faithfulness of Jonathan. We're going to talk about that. But what I find remarkable is David's willingness to restore to Mephibosheth all that belonged to Saul. To restore all that he had and give it to him. That David was willing to look beyond the hurt of the past. That David was willing to look beyond the pain of the past. And I guarantee you, David had a lot of pain. I guarantee you, David had a lot of hurt. And if you want to read about some of the pain and some of the hurt that David had, read the Psalms. David was the type of person, I believe, that just kind of wore his emotions on his sleeve. Type of guy that when you asked him, hey, David, how's it going? He told you. It wasn't just like, hey, it's good, everything's fine. David's like, oh, man, let me tell you what's going on. And David went through a lot of turmoil, and David had a lot of pain in his life, and that's reflected in a lot of his writings through the Psalms, where he'll talk about his enemies oppressing him. He'll talk about people forsaking him, and I'm sure that what Saul had done in relation to David, part of the family, Saul's servant, accomplishing amazing things militarily for Saul. Saul turned on him. Saul betrayed him. Saul abused him. Saul tried to kill him. And what we find is that there's this incredible response, that there was grace enough to bring Saul's grandson in and say, I want to give you all that belonged to Saul, that the house of Saul would not be destroyed, that the house of Saul would continue to move on. And see, what happens is in life, we have people in our past that hurt us. We all do. Some more than others. Some of you are sitting here this morning and you can think and remember that person who hurt you. Because that relationship is gone, that relationship is destroyed. Some of you, it goes back to your childhood. But withholding grace, hanging on to the pain, withholding the grace will produce this thing we call bitterness. Not something that we see in David Not at all. What we see in David is grace, grace, grace. You see, bitterness is harbored hurt. Someone hurt you, and you hang on to it. You develop anger toward them. The relationship is severed, and you're not willing to make it right. You're not willing to talk to them about it. Well, they never asked me to forgive them. They never came to me. So what we do is we hang on to our anger, don't we? We hold on to our anger. And ultimately, it begins to rob us of our joy. And what bitterness does, like a root that grows deep into the ground, it grips our heart and it grips our lives and it begins to consume us. And one of the things that will rob you of your joy more than anything is a unwillingness to extend grace to those who least deserve it. But you don't know what they did to me, Doug. You have no idea what they did to me. Listen, I've counseled a lot of people who have sat there and said that same thing. They did this to me, and they shouldn't have done it to me. And you're right. They were wrong. They did sin against you. They were wrong. But if you allow your heart to hang on to the bitterness, if you are unwilling to release that and give that to God and give grace to the one who least deserves it, I'm telling you, the bitterness will rob you of your joy and it'll eat away at your heart. And the very nature of grace is this: they don't deserve my forgiveness. They don't deserve for me to forgive. And grace says, I forgive. Let's read on, verse 9. Then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, all that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson, and you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him and shall bring in the produce that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. So Ziba, you were Saul's servant, now you're Mephibosheth's servant. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table. Not only does David restore his land, give him his wealth, but he brings him to his table. As David would sit and dine with his sons, the princes of Israel, there sat Mephibosheth dining with them at the king's table. Now Ziba had 15 sons. I have no idea how that guy made it. I've got 3 and I'm about ready to go crazy. But 15 sons, 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so will your servant do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. And notice how the narrative ends before chapter 10. What's it say? Now he was lame in both feet. Well, we knew that already. We knew that. In fact, this is actually the third time in Scripture where it mentions Mephibosheth being lame. The first is actually the story of when word came that Saul had been killed. The one caring for Mephibosheth was leaving, running away, hoping that Mephibosheth wouldn't be found and killed as well. She dropped him as a child, and in fleeing the house, she dropped him and he became paralyzed. Earlier in the chapter, we find that he was lame. And then the end of this chapter, oh, by the way, he was lame. So I think secondly, what we see from this is that grace lifts up the broken. David, in many ways, will give us a picture of Christ in the Old Testament. He'll foreshadow He'll point to Jesus and what Jesus would do in the New Testament. And it's no coincidence that the writer, Samuel here, writes and says, oh, by the way, Mephibosheth was lame in both his feet. What's he pointing to? Why is he emphasizing his brokenness? Why is he emphasizing the fact that Mephibosheth was lame? But we knew that once again. Why is he once again in the narrative drawing our attention back to Mephibosheth's brokenness? Because as Mephibosheth was broken, so are we. Now it gets personal because all of a sudden we're forced to reflect on our own brokenness, aren't we? As Mephibosheth was broken, as he was lame and invited to sit at the king's table and brought in, so are we. And we find ourselves as men and women who are broken. Sin has shattered our lives. Sin has consumed us from time. We have been men and women who are failures, and we know it. We know who we are when we look in the mirror. We are confronted with our own failures. We are confronted with our own weaknesses. And every one of us, when we lay our heads down on the pillow at night, we're confronted with the fact that we know we're broken. And yet there's a God in heaven who comes to us and says, I want to invite you to sit at my table. In spite of your brokenness, in spite of all that's gone wrong, in spite of all that you've messed up in your life, because you have made a mess of your life, in spite of that, there is a king who says, come. I want you to sit at my table. That is grace, because we don't deserve that invitation. We don't deserve to come to the king's table. But what David does is he gives us a picture of what Christ does in the New Testament. When Christ calls out to the broken, when Christ calls out to the hurting, and he says, come all to me, all that labor, and I will give you rest. I will give you rest for your souls. And then we have the promise one day, when our King does return, of dining with the King in a new heaven and a new earth. So this is the invitation that's given. You who are broken, grace will lift you up. You who are lame, you who have made a mess out of your lives, come dine with the King. That invitation's given to everybody who will receive it. So as Mephibosheth was invited to the king's table, so are we. But David could do nothing to heal Mephibosheth's brokenness, could he? The only thing the table could do would hide his brokenness. Yet David's greater son, Jesus, gives us grace. Simply does not see past our brokenness. What does Jesus in the gospel do? He heals our brokenness. And if you're hurting, and if sin has crushed you, Jesus knocks and says, I can heal. I can take a broken past and I can heal you. I can take bitterness that you're hanging on to and I can heal you. I can take the mistakes you've made. While there still may be consequences, I can heal you and I can restore your joy. And then really the point of this text is this: grace received mandates that grace be given. Who did David remember? It says, I remember Jonathan, who on that day made a covenant with me where he gave me his robe. He gave me his sword. He deferred to me the kingdom. I remember Jonathan. I remembered the grace he gave me. I remember the love that he bestowed upon me. And as I have received grace, I want to give grace. And that really is the point of this narrative, is that as David has received so much grace, yes, grace from God, through Jonathan, David in turn says, I will be one who shows grace to others. I will be one who extends grace to others. And so the challenge to us is you must remember the one who's given grace to you, every one of us. If you know Jesus, if you've been invited and you are a part of this kingdom over which Jesus rules, you've been given grace. How dare we withhold grace from others? How can you withhold grace when you yourself have received so much grace? That as David remembered the one who showed him grace, that we as men and women would remember the one who showed us grace. That we would, in the grace that we've been given, that we would be able to let go of the hurts of our past and extend forgiveness and grace to those who least deserve it. And lastly, are we people marked by grace to one another? See, the church and the relationships within the church are difficult. And there's a lot of things that happen in the church that produce bitterness. The church is not a perfect place. It's not. The church is not led by perfect men. People will hurt you. People will sin against you. But one of the things that makes the church not a perfect place but an amazing place is this concept of grace. That we would remember the one who showed us grace and in turn show one another grace. See, I said at the beginning that the heartbeat of God is grace. That we would so reflect Him in our lives and how we treat one another. And then, as we go out from this place, how we would respond to the lost and the needy and the broken around us. Sometimes I get concerned that we as Christians get frustrated that people who don't know Christ live as people who don't know Christ. Well, that guy at work, he just cusses all the time. And he drinks a lot, and he just tells, bad, dirty jokes, and yeah. And so did you. So did I. And what grace mandates is that as God gave us grace, those of us who were blasphemers against God, and if you don't think you were, you are. You were. We've all blasphemed God's law. We've all violated His law. Those of us who have received, those of us who were formerly blasphemers, have now found ourselves seated at the King's table. We extend that invitation to everybody. And so as we close this morning, I do want to sing one last song. The name of the song is Our God is Greater. The reason I love this song and the reason I think this song ties into what we're talking about today is this. There are some painful memories that some of you carry around with you to this day. There is some anger that some of you are having a hard time letting go of. This concept of grace is something that some of you are afraid of. This understanding that I could actually let go of the pain of the past, this idea that I could actually show grace to those who don't deserve it. Who is greater than your past? Jesus is. Who is bigger and stronger than those who have hurt you? Jesus is. Is the grace of God big enough and great enough to heal you? Yes, it is. And so as we reflect on Jesus this morning, as David pointed to Jesus in the grace that he showed Mephibosheth, so we receive this grace, and what happens is we recognize that the grace of God is bigger than our past. We recognize that the grace of God is able to heal our brokenness, and so God is greater. God is greater than your past. God is greater than your pain. God is greater than your bitterness. God is greater than all of that because He can heal if you'll let Him.